Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. You're watching The Naturalist Capitalist, and I'm your host, Reed Coverdale, and I've got my friend Charles Anderson from the Lone Wolf Podcast back on. How's it going, Charles?
Just enjoying the weekend. How are you, Reed?
I'm doing well. So you've got, I don't know what you'd call it, like a series or something called The Brown Wave on your podcast now. Is that just like an election special, or what's that all about?
Yeah, me and David Spurrier kind of came up with the term, the Brown Wave 2020. Arguably, we've been getting quite a few of those in the past, but we're going to definitely, use that term for this year because of all the fun things that have led up to this point. But, I've made a little special intro. I'll be using that on videos going through Election Day. And at points in times, I may break it out past Election Day if there's something really nice to talk about involving the Democrats or the Republicans. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, I sort of doubt that will happen. So, I wanted to open up this conversation with a tweet that Mike Lee put out on October 8th, which I believe was Thursday. And I think it was while he was watching this would have been a day after the vice presidential debate, I think. But he said, democracy is not the objective. Liberty, peace, and prosperity are. We want the human condition to flourish. Rank democracy can thwart that. So this has caused a tidal wave of anger on Twitter. And I think a lot of these people who are commenting don't know anything about Mike Lee, who he is. I'm actually a fan of his for the most part. He's, as far as politicians go from the two-party system, he's pretty good. He's pretty anti-war, pretty good on civil liberties, pretty good on criminal justice reform, things like that. But what he's talking about when he says rank democracy, he's being a little hyperbolic, and he's talking about just complete rule of the majority, regardless of what the repercussions are. So if you read more of his tweets, and if you knew about Mike Lee, you know that he said that he says things like, we're supposed to have a constitutional republic, not a democracy. So the difference between a constitutional republic and a democracy is the Constitution trumps the will of the people. So let's say the people want to institute slavery again, or they want to get rid of free speech, or they want to, get rid of the Second Amendment, whatever. The Constitution stands in between the majority and the minority and protects the minority. That's the idea. If you want to change that, then you have to make a constitutional amendment, which is a ton of work. So it's a pretty good check and balance system. My problem is taking this from Mike Lee. He is a pretty big Trump supporter, and he's not a very big critic of the Republican Party, I wouldn't say in general. And what we have through the current two-party system is a rule of the minority, which is even worse. So there's nothing checking and balancing a small group of people in the government from having absolute authority. I mean, it's basically Pelosi, McConnell, Trump, and the Supreme Court. That's what runs our country right now. Right. And I think that's way worse. So if it were coming from someone like Justin Amash or someone outside the two-party system, this tweet, I think, wouldn't deserve as much backlash. But when you have someone like Trump, who has abused the crap out of executive power, it's kind of hypocritical. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that whole idea of democracy, and coming from Mike Lee, what do you think?
Well, I'll be honest. If we had a more informed society, direct democracy might not be such a bad thing, but we don't have that. So, right. I've said for a long time, even before I had a YouTube channel, I wouldn't feel comfortable with a complete direct democracy in our country. There's just too many people who've gotten too careless and they listen to things like CNN and Fox News and this and that they would be legislating themselves into trouble because they really don't know any better. They listen to propaganda media and think they know a lot. They really don't know much. That's why they think they're voting for anti-war candidates or someone that's going to bring upon police reform and criminal justice reform. And these are actually candidates who've gotten us into more war, funded the police more, and put people in jail for things they've done themselves. So that's problem number one. When I read his tweet, one thing that I know is when he mentioned a ranked democracy, I kind of wondered if maybe he even might have been kind of taking a jab at like ranked choice voting or something, which kind of the way I've understand of the basic ranked choice voting is it's basically going to be the popular vote, but you vote by rank. Okay, so from my understanding, most people who call for that still want to abolish the Electoral College. In my take, if I were to institute ranked choice voting, and I do think that it's a lot better, it also helps third parties out a lot better to get around this two-party dictatorship. But I would keep the Electoral College. I would do that simply because I think it should go state by state. Who does this state want? And then who does this state want? And then they need to reach a certain goal. You know what I mean? That goal would probably have to be lowered down below 270, though, let's be honest, because it has the potential to be split in 3 or 4 different ways, maybe even more if another party come along. Right. So that's my only kind of nuance to the ranked choice voting. I wouldn't want it to be just based on the popular vote anyway. And again, that goes back to just because I don't know that too much of America does their own research about what's actually going on in their country. They're just reliant upon propaganda to tell them everything they need to know. What they're going to tell you is what they want you to know. Right. So that's a big problem. And honestly, I mean, the concept of direct democracy, we get down to the difference between reality and utopia. Direct democracy has been tried in places in the past, and the problem is that it's kind of a human nature. When things go kind of well for a long time, when you don't have war in your backyard or things like that, people tend to get a little spoiled. We've got all of our media that we consume, and people have just kind of unplugged from keeping up with politics the way we did when we first became a country and had to break away from someone else and took it real seriously. Yeah. I think that's been a big problem. And so literally, the republic was put there so that we would elect people. Now, you could argue those people were there to do the bidding of the constituents, and sure, and arguably, yeah, they're not really doing that today in a lot of ways, but, that's why we need to put somebody other than the two parties. But nonetheless, they were put there to go to legislate on behalf of the people. That way, at the end of the day, it's got influence from the people. But like you brought up, let's say that, they wanted to bring back slavery. Or let's say that today, because of all the woke folks out there, because as you pointed out, there's a lot of a minority trying to govern right now. Let's say that there was this movement that because white people owned black people as slaves, if we can't give them money reparations, maybe we should become indentured servants for X amount of time to repay our debts, right? See, that's not going to fly. But if enough of the country signed on to it and it was direct democracy, you could very easily end up with something like that. I think that would be kind of even a bit of a stretch to win the majority of the country on, but that just making the case. You've got politicians who are supposed to be elected to be the brighter one to say, no, this isn't going to be good for the country as a whole. That's what they're supposed to be there for. And then also, of course, the Supreme Court to keep a check on anything that is legislated to make sure that's also constitutional and doesn't violate anyone's rights as well.
Yeah, I want to touch on ranked choice voting and the Electoral College because you brought those up. As far as I know, at least every libertarian I've spoken with, they want what you just pointed out, which is ranked choice voting, but keep the Electoral College. I think more progressives or Greens, they want to get rid of it.
Right.
Electoral College could actually help third parties, because if a third party wins a majority of a district, then they win the entire district. So once third parties break a certain threshold, the electoral college would not hurt them anymore. It's one of those things that we have in place so that, it is a Republican, a small r Republican idea, that the states have a voice instead of just the majority. This is one of those direct democracy things again. But I actually would be okay with getting rid of the Electoral College if we actually followed the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is more important than the Electoral College, because in my mind, if we followed the 10th Amendment, then it wouldn't really matter who became president. If we followed the entire Constitution, I should say, it wouldn't matter who became president. You wouldn't even really notice a giant transfer of power. The problem is when a president gets elected, he makes dozens and dozens of appointments that are not elected. It's just his decision. I remember when Trump won the election in 2016, he even admitted that he was surprised how many decisions were on his shoulders to make. And, to me, seeing everyone freak out about that, I was saying, okay, people, instead of being angry that Trump is president, you should be angry that all this power resides in the presidency, because it was never meant to be that way. None of these departments that you appoint the head of existed back when the Constitution was drafted. So it's just turned into this giant bureaucracy that the president has complete control over. So, that kind of brings about the other thing I wanted to talk about, which was, given what the federal government has become, not what it's supposed to be, not what it could be, but given what it is, I'm not sure that it's a net good anymore, and I'm not sure it does anything good that the states couldn't handle. And so what I mean by that is, even the military, that's what we say we need the federal government for. We need it for the Department of Defense. Why couldn't the states handle that? Why can't we just divide the military up into 50 pieces, give it to each state? I feel like if the federal government is going to exist, it should basically be a moderator between the states. Like, it should really just be a court system that is deciding whether things are constitutional or not. And the states really deserve sovereignty over themselves unless they're violating the Constitution. But the federal government has completely abandoned any notion of being that restricted or being principled or being neutral or being constitutional or anything. I've been listening to people like Adam Kokesh and Dan Taxation and Steph Berman, like all these people who I used to think were nuts. And then listening to them talk about actually getting rid of the federal government and just having state and local governments, it doesn't sound that nuts anymore if you actually look at what our federal government has become and what the alternative forms of governing would look like. So obviously this is all hypothetical. This is never going to happen, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
No, definitely our current federal government is not what our federal government should be. There's a lot of paperwork, the red tape and the regulation and whatnot and stuff, and that hurts a lot of issues with inside the states, for example. If we were just state government and most of our taxes went towards that, then our federal government wouldn't be able to have such a military industrial complex going on. You see what I mean? So I don't know that I support a complete deletion of the federal government, but it certainly needs to be taken down by about 180 pegs. Okay, it is way, way too big, way too powerful. The only thing that, like you point out, it needs to be there for is to uphold civil rights and the Constitution for the people across the 50 states. The problem with removing the federal government altogether is that if they're gone, and it's just up to the states, you then encounter, what if they want to impose just one religion? And you know, you enter into a world of, if there's no one there to enforce the Constitution, as we pointed out, the problem with a direct democracy, if there's no one over the states, and there's so many people within a state like California who want to outlaw religion. It's illegal to have religion in our state because we believe that religion has caused too many problems. If there's no federal government there to keep that in check, it's very possible that it could happen. Or, you know, Washington State, because we all know, you know, what goes on in places like Oregon and Seattle with Portland and all that. So, you know, that could be very real dangers by not having a federal government at all. But by, you know, the problem with keeping them, on the other hand, is that they always tend to want to get out of control and just keep taking on a bigger and bigger role. So it's a real fine line to walk, but definitely they need to be reined in a lot from where they're at right now. Honestly, when we come down to things like, you know, the war on drugs, the drinking age, the smoking age, all these different things, marriage, all this stuff, these should be states' issues. You know, a lot of states took the lead on that, even though the federal government refuses to do anything, and I applaud them for that. But that is a prime example of where the federal government is just overstepping their boundaries, and that this is not the way the founders intended for this to be. You know, they need to be there to kind of keep the states together. And I would say, this is just me hypothetically, the founders had it more accurate when they first started the federal government and how the president and the vice president was supposed to be done. Because I think this only lasted through Washington and maybe one more. I don't know if it might have been around for Adams, but the way it was structured was the people who ran, the winner was the president, and the runner-up was the vice president. And of course, that forced them to kind of have to work together and get along to some degree because you're both elected at this point, right? On the other hand, that didn't go very well even for folks back then. They had squabbling partisanship, and that ended very quickly. But I like the idea much better because I feel like, you know, appointing my vice president, which is the person, if anything happens to me, is going to replace me and they're going to be almost just like me, creates that's more of that squabbling partisanship. And I think it's helped spread the two parties further and further apart over the years, where it's just a fight for power rather than, okay, we're going to both run, but we're going to wind up having to work together. You know, so I would take that if we were to restructure the federal government. First of all, shrink them down. They don't need to be nearly as big, and actually put some things in place that's going to force them to work together for the good of the people, not just sit around bicker and squabble over power all day long.
Yeah, you brought up an interesting point there about how the states have been ahead of the feds occasionally, because I think the reason most people like the federal government having power is because of things like slavery. You know, I think in most people's minds, the federal government is more progressive, and I mean that in the literal meaning of progressive, like, you know, forward thinking or modern thinking, not progressive has come to mean in America, but you know, they're more enlightened in general is what a lot of people think, and I think that has been true in some instances, like with slavery and like with segregation, things like that. But as you pointed out, you know, marijuana is still federally illegal. Yeah. And a lot of states were pushing on the door of things like gay marriage before the federal government was. Right. So it really comes to this question of, what is the federal government necessarily better at than the state governments? It's a philosophical question of, is centralized power better or is decentralized power better? Which one is going to move our society forward faster? And in my mind, it's kind of a toss-up. Like, I don't really think the federal government has been more progressive than the state governments. I feel like it's just been different issues. So I agree with your general premise that and it was my premise too, that the federal government, it really should be like the Supreme Court, and that's about it. Like the idea of, no, you can't do this. Yes, you have to do this. The ruling from Washington, instead of just being a judge, has just completely destroyed our governing system because, as you pointed out, that's not how the founders envisioned it, and it just doesn't work because you end up with such disparity throughout 50 states when a small group of people thousands of miles away from certain areas who don't understand the social fabric of that state, or they don't understand the economy of that state, they have these blanket rules and they set them down, and it just screws over the entire population. And sometimes a few people make out really well while the rest are swept under the rug. So how do we, given where we are now, how do we go back to that? You know what I mean? Like, I don't, I just don't see it happening. It seems like it just gets worse every year.
Well, it's one of those issues that, I'll be honest with you, we can try to take the optimistic approach and lay out the case for how to do it. But as far as practicality goes, I don't know that it's really going to be that easy to do. There's just sometimes you don't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Right.
And it is possible. But if we're talking about, get this kind of voting, put into place, or we're going to do this and that at the ballot box, that fight is going to be so tough. And namely because you don't have enough people clicked in to what's really going on, as I referenced earlier. So just to even have the numbers in the majority to try to go out there and just, what's the term when, like, the underdog win, the upset, to have that kind of upset victory over the system, you're gonna have to educate a lot of people first and get them plugged back into caring about this and their country, and break their minds away from, we've only got to vote for Democrats and Republicans. That is tasking enough, and would probably even take a few years if you were successful. Then after you get that accomplished, after a few years, now you've got to try to defeat them at the ballot box and hope that the status quo and the powers that be haven't caught on to what you're doing, and then start putting heavier censorship measures in place. That, there's so many variables there. The what ifs are, they're nothing but that ifs. There's no guarantees you can do any of these things. And it's kind of like my grandma used to say about all the what ifs. If a bullfrog had wings, he wouldn't bust his butt every time he jumped. So you've got just way too many ifs there. The only thing I would say that is 100% for sure a possibility to take the current system and bring it back down to a more basic level where it can be restructured without trying to bypass the mainstream media, the current voting system, waking people up. The only thing that's really going to be able to do that is if the people who keep getting elected just completely take our country into the toilet and we crash. We wind up in civil war in the streets, and our country is gone to hell in a handbasket. If it reaches that point where we start to seriously look like a third world country and people can't take it anymore, and there's violence from coast to coast, and we're in a big war, sooner or later, either we're going to wipe everyone out and nothing but war, or eventually something is going to come out of that. And I don't know that unless we turn into a complete, dictatorship, because the military comes in, squashes all the protesters, and at this point we have no freedom. It's just nothing but a complete police state because of it. You could either wind up with that, you could come out of it winding up with socialism, communism, or potentially what we're talking about. Something's going to come out of it. But the question is, what would come out of it? So you're either going to wind up reaching that point, or we could try to do things the other way. And that's the way I would honestly prefer it be done. I don't want to see chaos all across the country. And the reason why is because, while there's problems that I can identify I would like to see improved upon, I'm out there working hard. I've got a family. I've got a home. I don't want that to be lost and torn down because of, chaos in the country just to restructure our government. I would like to see it done the way the founding fathers intended, and that is at the ballot box, replacing these politicians. But I also recognize just how far gone the powers that be have destroyed this system and propagandized everyone to believe third parties will never win. You've got to go with Democrats and Republicans. I mean, as a matter of fact, Michelle Obama herself just came out recently talking about how when you go vote, you don't throw your vote away. Never once in her life did she ever think that not going to vote was an option. No, you've been given a wonderful opportunity to go vote, and you need to go out and vote like your lives depend on it. And quoting now, don't waste your vote on a protest candidate.
Yeah.
So that's the big problem. So yeah, I want to see things done that way, but it's going to be a hard hill to climb for sure.
Yeah, something that's interesting is a lot of people like populism and they don't really care where it's coming from. So a lot of people who were Ron Paul supporters were also Bernie Sanders supporters.
Yeah.
And if you look at those two messages, they're not very similar. They're on very opposite ends of the spectrum. So that's what kind of scares me about America is we're so emotionally attached to messaging, and we care so much about if someone is strong or tough. We don't care if they're telling the truth. So, I see a lot of these progressive commentators like Kyle Kulinski or Jimmy Dore or, people like that. And they're always talking about populism. We need populism. To me, it's more important to tell the truth than to tell people they're being screwed over. And the truth is they are being screwed over. But you've got to tell them the truth about the nastiness of our situation and what's coming forward. So, I think a lot of Americans, if they listen to people who tell the truth, like Joe Jorgensen, they're not going to like the sound of it. They don't like the fact that our monetary system is crumbling and that, we can't just print off money forever and make all these social programs that we want. That's what they want to hear. But when they hear the truth, it's ugly and they reject it. And I think that's what our biggest downfall is going to be, because we want to hear someone who's telling us that we as individuals don't have to do anything. It's all on the government that has been screwing us over to get its act together and then we'll be fine. That's what they want to hear. So when you tell them, look, things are going to be tough. You're not going to have 0% interest on your house anymore if we start adjusting our economy to be reflective of the position we're in. Interest rates are going to be over 20%, probably even higher. Things are going to tank and it's not going to be fun, but we have to do this in order to correct the position where we are. No one wants to hear that. So in my mind, we're doomed regardless because no one's going to want to, everyone's just going to ignore the truth and just keep continuing down this road.
Well, and I agree with you on that. You brought up a real good point. Do I think that it's possible we could get a lot of support behind the Libertarian Party, Joe Jorgensen, or even somebody else? I do believe it's possible, but you touched on something really important there, and that is the mentality of what we would call future of our country, right? A lot of the young folks, people in my age bracket that have grown up getting spoiled as children. Right. So people have to understand where, yes, we're identifying our current situation as tough times. And yes, even in the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of jobs were lost, but there was a lot of prosperity still yet from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. I mean, times kind of got tougher, but by no means were we living like we were back in the 20s, 30s, and the 40s. Okay, right. There was a big prosperity there. So that means all the kids that came up had a better way of life. Parents naturally want to give their children, if they're good, honest, responsible parents, most loving parents, want to provide a way of life for their children that was better than the ones that they had. They're like, okay, this is what I had, and I want to give you even more. And that's noble. It's honorable, but at the same time, you've got to still instill the value of hard work. You've got to instill the value of respecting each other. And a lot of those teachings have not been passed down to a lot of folks in the last 20, 30 years. I'll just be honest with you. It was with me, because I was raised for a lot of years with my grandparents. Mm-hmm. But for a lot of other kids, for example, the old school things of yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, gone. You don't hardly hear anybody say things like that anymore. I'm going to tell you right now, I would get fussed at if I ever just said yes or no. If I didn't have a sir or a ma'am on it, I was in big trouble. Okay, I would get fussed at big time, and then that was at the minimum. If I made too much a habit out of it, I might even, as a little kid, get my toys taken away or something. Respect was a big thing with my family growing up and my grandparents. But thing is, these values were not instilled. And so we've gone down, we've talked about education in our videos. We've talked about how our education system has pretty much told all these people, if you want to be successful in life, go to this 4-year college, get this degree, and the degree they come out of there with is probably something in psychology or something like that, something that there's not a litany of jobs just waiting around on you. And now either a lot of federal money was used to pay for it, or you took out loans and now you're in debt, right? So the problem is the system has failed a lot of people, and because that you've got to make your own way and really get out there and work mentality wasn't put into these people, they're sitting there now with their hands going, well, what do we do? We've done everything. We went through college. We can't get jobs. And so honestly, there's a case to be made, I feel like, on their behalf. The federal government did create this mess. The federal government sticking their nose in too much, all these, loans, all these colleges, making you take unnecessary courses so they could suck money from the government through funding or whatever. Okay. There's an argument to be made that because the federal government, because they lost all these jobs, because they messed up education, because they created this mess, well, why shouldn't they have to fix it for me? There's a valid argument to be made there, but at the same time, while that argument has some validity, you also have to understand there's bad things that are going to happen. And the federal government, fixing it, if they were to come in and fix it, it does not need to be a system of fix the issue and then prop everyone else up. It needs to be an issue of, okay, this is where we made a error. In response to this, we will fix this error, and then we're going to create a better system so we don't have to fix this in the future. Instead of having these colleges do things this way, let's put some reforms in place. Let's create schools. Let's create more trade schools, things like that. And if you're going to college for this degree and you're going to be getting federal money, you're going to be taking classes that would pertain to that degree. So when you go for criminal justice, you're not taking anything on astrology because it has nothing to do with knowing the laws. Okay. That's the kind of thing that we should be doing. But unfortunately, again, that mentality of I've gotten my way and never really had to work hard and get out there and sweat and break my back for things. That mentality carries over to saying, well, you created a system, you need to fix it. And the way to fix it is to just make it all easy for us because you're our government and you're here to serve us. Right. That's a big mentality there. And you could say it's a fault of parenting, a fault of society. But honestly, that as I said, the premise, the government needs to fix it. You're not going to be able to win a popularity contest by saying they don't have to fix anything, simply because they did create this big problem. But it becomes a deeper subject of we could approach that with some folks by saying, the government needs to fix it. for these folks, but we need to fix it not just by throwing tons of money so all these colleges are now free, because there's a lot of waste in these colleges. There's a lot of things that they're going to do and they're going to take advantage of, just like they've been doing over the years. We're going to, when we express that, and as you've pointed out, libertarians need a better marketing strategy. So when we say these things, we really need to get more in depth, and instead of just saying, no, that's way too costly, so as far as free college for everyone goes, nope, we don't need to do that. You got a point, but let's elaborate on that a little more and explain why there is a better option there that's going to be better for the people who wind up going to college, better for the people who come out of college, and better for our tax dollars than what's being proposed here.
Yeah. What's amazing to me is that it's so obvious, if you actually look at the facts and the statistics, what has caused wealth inequality over the last 100 years. And it's the Federal Reserve and our monetary system. It's laid out, by creating artificially low interest rates and getting the middle class to borrow money that they can't pay back, to take loans out that they can't afford, to use money they don't have, to just drain their savings and make them subservient. But you have conservatives blaming, our economic problems on the bottom draggers, the leechers, the welfare moms. They're what are screwing us over. And then the progressives blame it on tax loopholes for the billionaires. And I would say that's a bigger problem than the welfare moms. But if you look at those tax loopholes, how much money leaks through compared to, our economic problems and our deficits, it's not that much. I mean, it's just a drop in the bucket. So you have these two factions who are screaming at each other about what the problem is. And then, given what happened this year, I don't know what the number is now. The most recent number I know is $7 trillion that we printed off, and we've been pumping it into the stock market, giving it to giant corporations. That's so obviously the issue right there. But you have the biggest two factions completely ignoring that and screaming at each other about these two other relative non-issues and saying, this is what's screwing us over. It's just like, guys, come on. I mean, it seems like both the conservatives and the progressives, you could get them to hate the Federal Reserve. It seems like that would be pretty easy. Get them to hate all this bailing out of Wall Street, bailing out the super rich. Like, if you're truly conservative or truly progressive, that should absolutely infuriate you. But what I've realized is, at least with progressives, they don't take on the Federal Reserve because they realize that we need this phony monetary system to support the programs that they want to put in place. Like, we can't have Medicare for all, free college, reparations, free housing, whatever else they want, without the Federal Reserve. They just want to switch it so that it's, instead of giving to the rich, they want to use it to give to the poor. And then conservatives, at least the politicians, they're bought out by a lot of these people that rely on the Federal Reserve. They're bought out by the military industrial complex and by the arms dealers and the weapons manufacturers. So they're going to, by default, blame it on the welfare moms, and the progressives by default are going to blame this on the tax loopholes. And so, I mean, it's just insane. And I that was actually why I started this show, because back in March when the CARES Act passed, and you saw where most of the money was going, and you saw that people like Bernie Sanders and Dan Crenshaw, supposedly like progressive socialist and strong conservative, are both getting together to vote on this giant corporate bailout.
Right.
People should be pulling their hair out of their heads, but they're not. It's just insane.
Yeah. Well, we'll start with this. What is the big argument? I'll take my renowned, so intelligent senator from my own state, Lindsey Graham.
Oh, yes.
What is Lindsey Graham's argument with that $600 being tacked on to unemployment checks? or all these other things about giving money back to people. What's the argument about even if UBI was feasible, why we shouldn't do it? Well, the argument is that if we just give people money to survive and they're not necessarily working for it at a job, they're not going to have incentive to balance their pocketbooks properly, incentives to go to work. They just know the government's going to give them all kind of money, right? That's the whole Republican argument about why they shouldn't give lower income, middle class folks some assistance. That's been the argument for years. So if that's true for us blue collar, hard working people, why is it not true for these utterly rich corporate millionaires and billionaires? If they know they can run their business, sloppy as they want to, waste money on yachts and parties and alcohol or whatever, and if they're going to fail and that could, oh my God, send the stock market into a crisis, well, we're going to come in there and bail you out, sir, because you're just too big to fail because my 401k might go in the toilet. Right. Okay. Like, really? It's, the other thing to consider there is all these congressmen and senators can invest in the stock market. And a lot of them, you could say it comes through these fundraisers and books they write or whatever, but they can invest. They're probably making money from the stock market. That should be absolutely prohibited. And so naturally, the fact they've probably got money tied up into these things, or the people who donate to their campaigns have huge money tied up into these things, then naturally when the stock market starts going downhill, they panic and they always bail them out. And so, of course, that's what is costing so much money. Between bailing out the banks, allowing big pharma to run amok, and funding a military industrial complex, that's why we can't get anything done. That's where all of our money's going. Right. Yes, the Republicans like to focus on the welfare moms as a way of pissing off people like myself, because I heard a lot of that, and before I did my own research, it made me mad. Naturally, I didn't get too far off, because even before I started hearing much on Fox News, I was listening to someone like Jesse Ventura who was calling them both out. So I kind of had that little bit of knowledge before I started following too much. But every time I would hear things like that, it took me a while to start really doing my own research, but I could listen to the right Hannity clip and it might make me mad. But then I had to do some research on this stuff, right? And will I deny there's not anyone out there gaming the system? Of course there is. Just like there's billionaires out there who game the system so they don't have to pay their taxes. Okay. And we could address both of those issues, but as you pointed out, the bigger problem is this insider trading, basically, that the Congress and the Senate and the people who make the laws are doing with their own money in the stock market or with their donors' money in the stock market, because they're always going to take care of them first in this corrupt system that we've got right now. That's the biggest problem. And so if you cut all of that out, I can address both of them. We can focus on the tax loopholes after we've stopped that. And as far as the Republicans' fear mongering is concerned, guess what? If we actually had money to invest back into our society to fix our infrastructure and things like, because we're wasting it all right now on things we don't need to be. If we took that money back and did the right things with it, there might not be so many welfare moms out there. But again, that's actually fixing the system the way that it should be, where incomes can grow, the government regulation isn't stifling the creations of businesses and things like that. If we fix that, then you got an entirely different system. And to point out one more example while we're on the subject of millionaires and billionaires, if you're wondering why a lot of that red tape has been put there to stop newer businesses from coming along, it's because those people who can donate to campaigns get a grab on the market, and then they want to bribe that politician to put all that red tape there so he doesn't have any competitors come along. Yes. He doesn't want competition because he can do with it whatever he wants at that point. So, That's why you don't get more jobs out there for competition to help that welfare mom out. So you can address that whole problem by fixing yours.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. You look at Amazon and Walmart, guess what they're pushing for right now? A $15 minimum wage, because, now they all pay their employees $15 an hour. So, hey, if that small business over there also has to do that, and this place has to do that, then they're not going to be able to compete with me. So you're absolutely right. Like, they get in bed with the politicians. If you pass this law, it'll make it harder for my competition to catch up with me. Seems like It should be obvious, but apparently it's not.
While you're getting it out, I'll elaborate a little bit on what you said about Walmart pushing for the $15 an hour minimum wage. Of course, I've given my thoughts. A state-by-state minimum wage, if we're going to have one, would be a lot more efficient because cost of living differs as you travel across the country. What it costs to live here would be, as you put earlier, drops in the bucket in New York. There's an apples and oranges comparison when you're trying to give a minimum wage across the country. And if you go high enough that someone in New York would be making enough to rent an apartment there, you would be raising my minimum wage so high you'd put all kind of people out of business who were small business owners here because you don't need nearly that much. I don't make much from what this minimum wage they're putting into place is. My wife doesn't even make $15 an hour. Now she gets incentives. She sells glasses. She works at an eye doctor. She gets incentives. So when you factor that in, that kind of brings her above 15. But between the two of us, we've got a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house and about a 1/4 acre of land. Okay. So that, try getting that in New York with that kind of income, or California, or possibly even Florida. It's just not going to happen. The cost of living differs. But the one thing that I'll say about Walmart is, let's be honest. They've been around how long? The family's made money like that for how long? They just now, if this was the right thing to do, why did it take you so long? Why haven't you been trying to pay your workers more over the years? Because that is a prime example of a big corporation that came in, monopolized, and tried to stifle business. Not only when they opened did they sell appliances and clothes and electronics, and I don't know where they started first and how much expansion they did, but all I know is I remember going in there as a kid at a local Walmart before they built the Walmart super centers. Okay, before the super centers come around, you could get clothes and toys in the lawn and garden and some appliances, but it wasn't grocery store. Then all of a sudden they became a grocery store too. Now, we already had grocery stores out there. We already had Ingles, we had Bilo, you have Publix, Food Lion, and there's even smaller, smaller business owned, little markets or whatever, right? So Walmart had to get into the grocery store business too. Well, then they got into having the eye doctor there. They started pulling more businesses in. Now, a lot of them opened up gas stations. So, you already had gas stations, and some of those gas stations put even smaller gas stations out of business. Now Walmart has to get in the gas station business too. So they've been literally trying to hurt competition for years and years and years. And we're paying their workers just dirt wages for a lot of those years. And now all of a sudden they want this $15 an hour minimum wage when a lot of their workers, Amazon too for a while, we're still having to bust their ass and then go home and apply for welfare. That's pitiful. So that that should show you right there, even if Walmart, even if you agree with a $15 an hour minimum wage, it goes to show you Walmart is certainly not the moral leader in the room who's just pushing for it just to do the right thing. They haven't done that for years anyway.
Yeah. I remember what I was going to say now. Last year, I made a lot of money. I worked like 3,000 hours. And I used to do power line work, and there were a lot of storms. So went down. I was living in New Hampshire, but we went out of state a lot to fix power lines. I made like 120 grand. And the federal government, just with federal income tax, they took out 20 grand. So I mean, I could use 20 grand right now.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
my pickup truck just got stolen a few weeks ago. I'm buying another one for about 13 and a half. You know, I could use that money for myself, and I've also given money to friends and family who need help. So I feel like I could use it responsibly. But seeing that 20 grand just taken out of my paycheck and then watching throughout this year to see what the federal government has decided to do with it, you know, I just have no sympathy for the argument that that is the price we pay to live in a civilized society. If that's the case, if a civilized society is the return we get for paying taxes, we all deserve a big tax refund this year, because I would say America has been anything but civilized this year.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's an even finer example of how the federal government is nearly incompetent. They can't deliver on anything. Right. You know, we vote them in there to end the war, and we're still at war. We vote them in there to end the war on drugs. Nope, we're not going to do that either. How about let's voted Obama into office, since we already touched on those two. When we voted Obama, close Guantanamo Bay, all the stuff about torture come out, right? Yeah, well, he didn't get that done either. Okay, we vote them in there for all these things and they can't deliver. We vote them in there for health care. They can't get that done. Okay, we vote them in there to help small business. They screw small business. And if the only argument at this point is that we're paying taxes and voting them in there so that we can live like civilized folks, well, have you looked around lately? Because we are at each other's throats pretty regular nowadays. You know, arguably a lot of people say that race relations and things like that have never improved since the 50s and the 60s. And I will say this, I don't buy into that argument. But would I say they're arguably about just as bad today as they could back then? Oh, for sure they are. But what I don't remember is so much hate and vitriol amongst people who live amongst each other 20 years ago. Back in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, yeah, we had hate crimes and whatnot. I mean, they never went completely away. But people coexisted much, much better than they are today. It's almost like we, right about 2012, kind of maybe before then, but definitely I would say past 2012, we might as well have jumped 60 to 80 years back in time, because it was nothing but tension amongst everyone. So that's a big problem there. But yeah, paying our taxes, you're right. I could use $20,000. You could use the $20,000. The federal government just chews through all this money to fund things. And what are these things supposed to be for? They're supposed to be to fund the programs that they have put in place, a lot of it to help me and you, right? They're supposed to be there to keep our country going properly and fund our nation. And when I mention policies, I mention things like Medicare for people who have Medicare. It's supposed to pay for that. It's supposed to pay for things like the VA. It's supposed to pay for things like the DMV. And it's supposed to be funding Social Security. Now, that's a good one to look at, because last time I checked, it's full of IOUs. The people paying taxes now are funding the people who already paid their taxes and need to be drawing from it. It's literally turned into a Ponzi scheme. And why? Because we paid taxes into it for the federal government to come in, dip their hands in it, and fund war going all the way back to Lyndon Johnson until they drained the pot dry. Okay? Yeah. So Social Security was absolutely destroyed thanks to our government. So literally we pay taxes for all these things to fund the federal government, but they're not doing anything with it. And speaking on paying them taxes, and you mentioned earlier about those billionaire tax loopholes, you know, it amazes me as to how many people deem this to be a regressive policy. And I guess if you really wanted to tax millionaires and billionaires at like 50 or 60% or something like that, and not tax us at a lower rate, then I guess, yeah, it would be kind of hard to institute it this way. But if you just want to get money out of them, because it does, as long as they can bypass the system, you could tax them at the Bernie Sanders, whatever, 80, 90%. Right. If they got loopholes, they're not going to pay it anyway.
Right.
Okay, so they're just going to bypass that. That's how Trump got away with paying like $750 or whatever, right? As long as they can do that, you could set the percentage at whatever you want to. If they could bypass it, they're going to find a way. And they got the money to pay a lawyer to figure that out.
Yeah.
So the way to bypass that, and even Jesse Ventura himself said this years ago, it's where I first heard this, put a national sales tax. If you really want to do it that way, and it doesn't have to be anything high, good God, you don't want to do it at 30% because you're going to hurt people like me.
Right.
But just put a national sales tax in place. And then if they're spending their money, they're paying taxes.
Right.
You know, and guess what? If they want to go buy a $60,000 motorhome or whatever to travel around the country, they're going to pay taxes on it. If they want to go buy a $100,000 yacht or whatever, I'm not a expert on the prices of yachts, by the way. I don't know if that's a good price or not. But if they're going to spend the money on one, they're going to pay taxes on that. You're going to pay your taxes regardless of your income based upon how you live. And if you have all these luxuries, you'll be paying taxes on them. That's a good way to get the money out of that. But even if we do that, again, fix the taxation, because right now, millionaires, billionaires, or thousandaires, we're not getting much of a return of investment from our government at all. We're not getting a civil society. And we're not getting anything that they've said they're going to do for us delivered. We're getting the short end of the stick all the way around.
Yeah, I agree with you on the sales tax, because that would be, I mean, if we are going to have taxation to fund things, that is the most honest and straightforward tax. Because if it's property tax or income tax, yeah, you can see what they're taking out of your paycheck, but you don't really notice it the way you would a sales tax. If every time you go buy something and you see the percentage that sales tax has, you're going to be more likely to vote based on who you want to be in charge, based on what the percentage of the sales tax is going to be. Absolutely. You're much more mindful of what amount of money you're sending to the government to fund it. I think if we had a sales tax, you'd see people vote differently because they'd realize how much of their money is really going to the government. The other thing is that would incentivize saving, because what we have now, there's no incentive to save whatsoever, because they tax you on your income. So you're screwed anyway. So they've already taken what they need. If they could only get at you through what you spend, you'd be much more likely to invest your money, to save your money. And a lot of people don't realize this, but an invest and save economy is much healthier than a borrow and spend. They've been telling us for years that borrowing and spending is the only way to stimulate the economy. In what other arena is that the truth, that if you borrow and spend, you're healthy financially? No one ever says that, you know? And I think it's immoral, you know, things like income tax and property tax, especially property tax. I mean, how can you say you own your house if you are taxed on living in your house? Like, once you buy your land, you buy your house, I don't think the government should have any say as to what you have to pay for that. Once you've paid for it, it should be yours. And then, you know, people say things like, oh, the fire department and this, or, well, fine, like add a fee for the fire department. Like if you want the fire department, you know, there should be some type of insurance you pay or something. But once you own your house and once you own anything, you shouldn't have to continue to pay the government to own it, because then you're asking permission to own something. You don't really own it. The government owns it, and you're paying a fee to keep the government from taking it away from you. In my mind, that's totally backwards. I completely agree that if we are going to have taxes, the sales tax is the only one that makes any sense.
Yeah, I agree. You know, the thing is, and I do want to see, you know, firefighters, local police, but I'm with you, paying the thing on the property tax. Another problem that you can't control is my home was built in the 70s. This is when the house that I live in was built, right? Okay. If all of a sudden, and me and my wife have already talked about this, right down the street, almost maybe not even a block away, there was a big clearing of land. I mean, there was a lot of acres for sale there. I mean, it was big. I never thought it was going to sell. But there's a lot of plants in my area. I've actually got a plant right across the street from my house. It used to be a boxing plant. They're a 18-wheeler body shop now. Mm-hmm. But I thought something like that would go there because of how big it was. They're putting a housing community in there. They've been doing construction on it for 2 or 3 months. Clearing it out, grading, all that, and then eventually they're going to start putting houses in, all that. These houses are going to be looking somewhere between the $100,000 to $200,000 range. Now, to put that in perspective for you about my neck of the woods, my house, and remember, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, I'm only paying about $70,000. I got a good house, you know. These are going to be way on up there. That's rich people housing, and it's right up the street from mine. But because it falls within my community, if those houses have such a value, in a way, if I were going to sell my house, that would be to my benefit because it's going to take the value of mine up. But if the value of your house goes up, guess what else goes up? Your taxes. Because now your house is worth more than it was when you initially bought it. You're having to pay property taxes based on the value. So if your house is worth more, even though I don't intend to sell it, I got to pay more in taxes just to keep it now than I did when I initially bought it. So, I mean, there's a benefit there if you're trying to sell your house. But for someone like in my house now, because of the growth and development around me, I'm having to pay more money just to keep my house. That's not exactly what you might call very fair to me or other people who are in my shoes. You know, I mean, and it's not something me and my wife won't be able to afford or anything, but it's just the simple principle of the matter. We bought this house, bought it at this price, and because something good is taking place, that there's nicer houses being built around me, all of a sudden I got to pay more taxes. You know, when to me, I should only have to pay more taxes if there's some legitimate reason why the county needed that tax money from me, which I haven't heard the case made. No, this case is just going to be, no, you're just going to pay more because your value went up because of the things around you all of a sudden. So that, you know, that's completely backwards to me. You know,
I shit you not, there is a view tax in New Hampshire that obviously hasn't been there forever, but if you have a nice view, they tax you more. And there is, I'm not making that up. Everyone watching this video, you can go look it up. There is a view tax in the state of New Hampshire. There was this, there's this amazing apple orchard that we used to go pick apples at, and they had hundreds of acres, and they were on a high hill where you could see the White Mountains in New Hampshire, just this beautiful view. They almost got put out of business because of their taxes, their property tax and their view tax. And it was an orchard that had been passed down through family generations, and the government was able to seize that from them because of the view they could see. I mean, if someone doesn't see the moral bankruptcy there, I don't know what to tell them.
Yeah. Well, you know, and I remember there was something else I was going to say a minute ago, but before I say that, speaking of your view tax, I should get a reimbursement because when I walk out my front door and all I see is a bunch of tractor trailers, you know, and some of these old guys that are trying to work on these things showing me the plumber's crack every morning. Yeah, that's not exactly a brilliant and beautiful view I want to walk out to, so give me a little bit of money back. But that aside, you know, you were talking about having an invest and save economy versus a borrow and spend. I don't know, Reed. Maybe they thought that when they paid all the debt off, it would improve their credit score or something. What do you think? Because you know, that's what they tell you to grow your credit score. Maybe, you know, we've got such geniuses on Capitol Hill that they thought, oh, we'll just borrow a bunch of money, and then we'll have great credit with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, the credit score, I think that's a Ponzi scheme too. It's just to encourage people to get into debt. And that's the problem with our system. Like, we actually need systemic change, because you are, as we pointed out with taxation or interest rates, anything, you are punished if you're responsible. If you are a single person with no kids and with no house, with an old vehicle, like, you don't get tax write-offs. You have to be an irresponsible or at least a spend happy person to get tax write-offs. They encourage you to go into debt. They encourage you to own stuff that you don't necessarily need. They encourage you to become a parent at a young age. Mm-hmm. And I think it's all just in the guise of, we can enslave the public to our banking system and uphold the richest people in the country, and the middle class won't even notice. And I mean, so I actually don't have a credit card, and I refuse to get one. I only ever buy things with cash. I have more in my savings than most people have in debt. My truck just got stolen, and I had a 1994 Toyota pickup, so it wasn't worth that much, but I'm buying another vehicle for 13 and a half grand. I'm paying out of my pocket with cash. And it doesn't necessarily benefit me. I could do better if I decided to get a credit card and get a credit score. But at least for now, while I can survive without doing that, I look at that as immoral, an immoral system. And I don't want to promote that system. I want to fight against it as long as I can by actually buying stuff I can afford. Because, that's what's just ruined this country, is people buying stuff that they can't afford and enslaving themselves into debt. And then you can't dismantle the system. Inflation is a terrible thing if you're a saver like me, because there's the interest rates are at zero. So your savings in the bank don't accrue any value. And at the same time, the dollar is losing its value. But if you are 50 grand in debt, inflation is great. It's like, oh, cool. That's not going to be as hard to pay off. So they've literally rigged the system to benefit people who are not responsible, or people who can't afford things. It's not sustainable, and we act like it is. But I mean, there are things coming down the pipe that we won't be able to handle, because the only reason this system survives is because the entire world is propping it up. But it hurts the rest of the world, because they don't have their own Federal Reserve that they can print their own dollars off with. They're forced to use our dollars, and they're forced to buy our bonds. And as the inflation occurs, the value of those dollars and bonds go down that they bought. So they're not going to put up with it forever, but we are acting like we're living in some alternate reality where we can get away with this forever. And it's just scary.
And I'm going to just be honest with you here. You've done better than me. I do have 2 credit cards. I opened up one, and the reason why was to start building a credit score. Someone advised me, they said, here's what you do with the credit card. Right. They said, you get one and buy gas, pay it off. Yep. Buy gas every month, just fill your car up, and then when it comes in, pay it, which is what I did. Built my credit score with that. But I did have to get one when we bought our house. We were doing some renovation work, so I got one with Home Depot. And we had paid it off until I had to replace my lawnmower over the summer. I had an old Craftsman, and it finally just stopped running. And I'm trying to still fix it. I might get it to my mom. She's going to be moving into a new house pretty soon. So I'm trying to get up and running at least for her. But I went out and bought a new Cub Cadet. And the thing is, with a lot of grass, I wanted another riding, because, getting an old push mower, that would have been a long day out there in the sun. But I invested for that, but I try to not just spend like crazy with a credit card. You get yourself wind up into a world of debt, and a lot of that's what tears apart the lives too. And so, like you said, the government's out there encouraging people to just spend for this benefit. It takes someone to really sit down and think about that in order to use it responsibly. If you don't, and it helped me because I actually had someone there who kind of explained a lot of that to me and explained, no, don't just get a credit card to just go buy things, because that's how you're going to rack up a big bill in a hurry. Go slow and steady. If you really, I was beneficial enough to have that. But I realized not a lot of other people were. And with the way, like you pointed out, the government's encouraging you to spend, just like our education system was encouraging people, instead of looking for a steady, job or taking something they could end up making good money. No, go to college and rack yourself up in debt and then possibly still not get a job. We've got a system that it just encourages people to get really, really, really into debt. And I think one of the best voices that I've heard out there who try to tell people to avoid that like the plague would be Dave Ramsey, for example. Now, in some cases, I'm a little more nuanced than Dave. I realize for some folks, it's a lot harder to just put back and save to buy everything you're going to need. For example, when me and my wife just got her RAV4 in July, we didn't go pay straight cash for it. Can't. I don't have me nor her have that much laying around. Just go hand, the dealership about $25,000 in cash or whatever. Right. We just don't have that laying around. But that aside, only do that when you have to. I mean, really try to, if you're wanting to build a credit score, and that's something else people got to understand. I'm with you. The credit score thing is a lot like a Ponzi scheme. It's entering people down that rabbit hole. But for a lot of folks, until we change that system, the advice that I would give them is like what me and my wife did. Use it responsibly. Do things that you can pay it right off, because then it will build your credit score up, meaning that when you go to look for a home or you go to buy that car, you will get lower interest rates and better deals because they don't deem you as such a liability. If you got an abysmal credit score, they're either not going to give you anything or you're going to be paying out the wazoo for it. So that's the one thing. If you're going to go into that rabbit hole, be sure to listen to some advice and do it responsibly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have any judgment against people like you who do that. My brother does that. He buys his groceries and that's it. Like he doesn't, he did buy a new truck, so he's paying that off. But aside from that, he uses his credit card to buy groceries every month and then just pays it off on time. That's what my parents did too. My parents were not wealthy at all. They had a credit card. They paid it off every week. And I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but that's a very low percentage of people who do that. And it's actually smarter than what I'm doing, I'll admit. Like I'm doing it out of principle. I'm almost like an Amish person who's not using technology out of principle. Like it's just I can get away with it now. And I just really look at the system as truly immoral and terrible. So I want to avoid it as long as I can. But it's just mind blowing. Looking at how everything has evolved over the decades and how people have Stockholm syndrome. They get sucked into the system and then they're immediately overwhelmed. So then they're reliant on the system. And then if you talk about abandoning the system, they lash out at you. In the libertarian movement, they call that, they say the government breaks your leg and then gives you a crutch, and we're trying to stop them from doing that, and you get angry that we're taking the crutch away. That kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where I said populism versus truth. The truth is not always comfortable, because the truth is we are living in an unsustainable system that cannot last, and a lot of people don't want to hear that. But I think a great example of how being responsible can save you happened to me this year. I quit my job in New Hampshire back in December, and then I had 5 different interviews for truck driving jobs out west. I had them in Arizona, Colorado, Washington, and here in Utah. And I had 2 in Arizona. And I headed out west after the February primary in New Hampshire because I was working on Tulsi's campaign and I wanted to, stick that out. And so in March, I moved out west. And then we all know what happened in March. The coronavirus exploded. All 5 of my interviews just fell through the floor. So here I was, no job in the middle of a pandemic. And I didn't have a job till June, but I didn't have to borrow any money from anyone. I wasn't screwed because I didn't have a paycheck coming in because I lived responsibly. I lived within my means. I had a lot of savings. I actually gave thousands of dollars to other people like in my family and friends who are having issues during that time. And I'm not saying this to brag. I'm just trying to illustrate to people that if we had a society that was responsible, you could take care of your neighbors, you could take care of your friends, you could take care of yourself. You wouldn't need all these programs and things that we always are saying are so essential that the government gives us. We need those things now because we're so irresponsible, because we're so reliant on the government. We need to go back to a time where we are self-sustaining. And, the money that I gave directly to my brother and directly to my friend who had a medical condition and he had no health insurance and he needed cash to pay for the doctor's bill, I just gave it directly to him and he's going to pay me back eventually. I would so much rather do that than give it to the government and expect them to responsibly distribute it and take care of people. This was actually a big platform that Vermin had when he was running. It was, instead of using the word charity, he said mutual aid, just taking care of each other. I think that is a much better system to use than giving a bunch of money to the government and expecting them to distribute it responsibly. I had a guy named Dan Berman on my show. He goes by Dan, Taxation is Theft Berman. And I was asking him, how do we fund things if we get rid of like general taxation? And he said, well, you still have to pay for things, but like roads, you would have tolls that pay for roads or bridges or whatever, instead of just giving this giant sum of money to the government and expecting them to redistribute it. Because when they do that, they find all sorts of little things. Oh, we could really use a new office building here, or this guy could really use a giant salary increase. If it's going directly to whatever you're using, it's much harder to embezzle those funds. Right. And I think he's totally right. So like the more decentralized everything is, the more direct every payment is, the more efficient it would be. But we're going the exact opposite direction. We're just going toward more centralization, more taxes, bigger government. And, we wonder why everything is so inefficient. I mean, what other, a lot of people aren't like you and me. A lot of people don't work in a blue collar field and see how, responsibilities are delegated to different areas of the workforce. They don't understand why centralization is not effective because they don't see it in practice. But I've certainly seen it in my line of work. When a small group of people are in charge of a big operation, it gets scary pretty fast instead of just letting everyone deal with their own specialty, their own skill set, and just expecting the job to get done that way. But yeah, I mean, it's just like we're headed the wrong direction. We've got to make an about face really quick.
And I agree. When you talk about the things like the roads and things like that, the tolls, it really helps. The only case that I think could be made in the opposite direction there would be when there's state of emergencies on something where the government sometimes has to be able to defer funds to help with whatever the emergency is. So whenever there's a natural disaster and a tornado or a hurricane wipes out a town, they'll rechannel some money to help for something like that, maybe than just, put a fresh coat of asphalt down on a road. Okay. That's the only argument I think can be made. But the problem is by opening that door and creating that opportunity, while it makes sense, and I'm not opposed to that concept, that is what has also given us the current system where, okay, just how much can we defer and what can we defer it for? And that is what I think has created a lot of the problems that you mentioned. So while I think having the ability to do it isn't necessarily a bad thing with the right example, it's the old cliche, give them an inch, they'll take a mile. Yeah. They've been able to take that money and do a lot more things with it than fix the coast of Florida, Puerto Rico, or wherever something, Midwest when the tornado came through. They've done a lot more things with it. And, like in a lot of businesses, there's been office execs who've wasted company funds on X, Y, and Z, right? But if it's a business and the stockholders or the investors or whoever find out about it, that guy could be out of a job. Right. Now, with it being in the government, the worst case scenario, the politician might go through a scandal. I mean, for example, two people that come to my mind that got busted with using taxpayer funds for their own personal use. My former state governor, Mark Sanford, was apparently using taxpayer money to fund his jet fuel to fly down to, I think, South America to see his mistress. Okay. John Conyers, who was a congressman from, I think, Michigan. I think he was from the Detroit area. I think he was first elected into office just after we became a country. I think he was put in like 1801 or something because he looked over 200 years old. Yeah. I mean, he was an ancient relic in politics. But he was apparently what ran him out of office and finally got him to resign was when the Me Too thing came up. He was one of those people that had the accusations made about sexually touching and assaulting women and this and that. And he had apparently used funds from taxes or whatever to pay off court settlements to some of the women who had accused him of things. So you're absolutely right. While I made the case for the argument earlier, this is what it's led to. And if we're going to give them that ability to defer funds for cases of emergency, someone needs to have something in place that absolutely prohibits something like that. And the problem is, who's going to get involved to do that? Yeah. So, if I had to take a choice between the two and just say, we can give them the option to defer money for emergencies, but they're going to also misuse it like this, or I would just make direct payment so I know what I'm paying for is used properly. While I wouldn't want to see someone get their property damaged by, what the insurance company calls an act of God and not be able to have their home rebuilt or whatever because of it, I also don't want to see my hard-earned money go to waste to pay off John Conyers' sex scandals or Mark Sanford's plane fuel so he can go see his mistress, because that's absolutely what crazy.
Yeah. I've actually got a story that ties in exactly to what you're talking about, and it is aid for natural disasters. So as I said, I used to work for a power line company. Right. And in 2018, I think it was, we were down in Connecticut because I think 3 tornadoes had touched down in Connecticut, and there were 500,000 people out of power. So we were down there for like 9 days. And the first few days, Eversource, which is the utility company that runs like most of New England and pretty much all of Connecticut, they were responsible for getting the power back on. So the first day was obviously a mess because we had no idea what was going on. But then, once they had their feet on the ground, they were scrambling to get poles and transformers and everything to us so we could fix everything as quickly as possible. After a few days, FEMA kicked in, which is the federal government subsidizing the disaster. And can you guess what happened after that? Production just went right downhill. And it got to the point where I think it was the governor of Connecticut and the CEO of Eversource were taking a ride through some town that I was in. And we got a call that, hey, if you are sitting in a parking lot doing nothing, which a lot of us had been doing for like 2 or 3 days because they couldn't figure out where a power outage was. We were just hanging out in parking lots. They said, turn your strobe lights on and just drive around because we want you to look busy as the governor and the CEO of Eversource come through. And I'm telling you, like you make a lot of money on storm trouble. Like I was making double time. And we were getting paid straight time to sleep overnight. The trucks are getting charged out at like $150 an hour. And then I had a pole trailer behind me that gets charged out at a similar amount. So like each crew, you've got 2 guys and a truck and a trailer usually. So you're talking around like $500 an hour. And there were thousands of line workers in Connecticut. And initially, this had been Eversource's responsibility to get this storm repaired on time. But then the federal government kicks in, and you've got these people, you've got crews getting $500 an hour, sitting for days in a parking lot. And, we were driving by broken poles, but we weren't allowed to set a new one because it wasn't our case or whatever, our case number that was sent to us. So while I like you, I agree with the sentiment. In practice, it actually backfires. It ends up causing the problem to be even worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And you brought up that they call you and tell you to stay busy. Who would think that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or I believe that's the correct breakdown of the acronym. Who would think they couldn't handle something properly? You know what I mean? But that's another example of a government agency that has been created that just causes more problems and isn't ran properly. And the fact that they've got to call you and tell you to stay busy. Why? Because they don't want it to look like you're sitting around doing nothing, right? So to me, what really should be shown, and it shouldn't be your fault, it shouldn't be any of your coworkers' fault, they should have saw you sitting there doing nothing, because then they might get pissed and want to know why ain't anything being done. And then if they actually investigate it and find out, they might be able to do something. But that's typical federal government. Cause a lot of problems and just try to cover it up so the people don't know what really took place, and we could enter into a real wormhole of different issues where the federal government has tried to use that tactic in the past to hide things from the public so they could still, get it their way. But that's something else.
I as I've talked about on this show, I voted for Rand Paul, or I didn't vote for him, but I supported him. He dropped out too early. And then I voted for Gary Johnson in 2016, but I wasn't a hardcore libertarian back then. It was more just, wow, Hillary and Trump suck so much, I'm going to vote for him. But then really seeing the consequences of centralization, of monopolies, because that's what utilities are. They have a monopoly. There's no competition. We were contractors, so we had to do our work. We had to work hard. We had to do a good job, or the utility wouldn't call us again. So you'd see us, aside from instances like the one I just mentioned, if we were just doing a regular job for them, we'd better show up on time. It had better be done properly. It had better look good, or they're going to call the other contractor next time. They're not going to call us again. So I just, living the 4 years after the 2016 election and seeing the repercussions of how certain types of economics work, it's what really turned me into a fiscal libertarian as well, because I just realized, as heartless as it sounds, it's the only thing that works, because human beings suck. We're driven by greed. That's just what we are. It's survival instinct. And, people talk about getting rid of capitalism, getting rid of free market economics, whatever. They're talking about trying to get rid of the human condition, which you can't do. Like if you institute socialism or communism, you still have that capitalist tendency of people. And now, instead of spread out amongst all the people so that they have to fend for themselves, you have concentrated it within a small amount of people who are going to use it to better themselves. That's what always happens. That's what happens in any governing system, any economic system. People suck. So that's why you have to hold them individually accountable instead of expecting a very small circle of people to act benevolently, because that's literally never happened and it never will happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's, I know, spoiler alert for some folks. I know me and you have been invited to do a debate with some folks who do believe that we should get rid of capitalism. I'm not sure when that's going to be, but I know it's supposed to be in the works. The thing on that is this, there was a man who he was referring to race relations in particular. They asked him, did he think race relations had improved? And he said, you can't legislate love. That has to be done by people of different races coming together, speaking together, interacting together, but you can't legislate love. That man's name was Denzel Washington, of all people, right? Not politics, great actor. I mean, he's a hell of an actor, but he said that. And that's the same thing when it comes to capitalism or socialism. The one thing that I will say is this: if you get money out of politics, where it is completely illegal for the rich to bribe politicians, and we actually have politicians who are a arm of the people, they are able to keep a check if they're doing their jobs properly on capitalism so that it doesn't become crony capitalism. But because of the way the system's been working for over 50 years, they've enabled what a lot of the left refers to as the crony capitalism today. But the problem with what the left's solution to that is to just do away with capitalism because it went bad in this instance. Not in all cases, but we could point to, again, the Walmarts, the Amazons, the people who tried to monopolize, which honestly isn't real capitalism because they're hurting competition.
Right.
So again, that to me, they fit within. I'll put them within that bubble of the crony capitalists. They're out to just make money, but stifle competition in the meantime. There's not an embetterment of the product that's better for the people. It is not how capitalism is supposed to work. And so if the government was there to do their job properly and weren't being bought off by the Walmarts and the Amazons, you could keep a check on that system. But if we did away with capitalism altogether and we go to just socialism or full-blown communism or whatever, the problem is that it is then completely the government controls everything. And if you're making the case to me, right, that the current government would be better than what we've got right now, look at these other government agencies. We just talked about FEMA. We talked about Social Security. We've talked about health care, the DMV. None of these things are being ran well. The United States Postal Service is not doing well when you compare it to UPS and FedEx. That's why they're constantly needing more money. The government has too much tendency to waste on programs. The other problem is that you wind up getting into issues where you start off socialist, communist, you get into the path, you potentially end up with dictatorships. And how do you keep a check on those sort of things? Because once you turn all that power over to the government, you have no ability to create competition. Right. If the government's going to own the grocery stores and the government's going to own the clothing stores and the government's going to own everything, the car dealerships, the manufacturing, if the government owns all of that and they're running it the way they're running the current system, which is completely crappy, certainly isn't good for the consumer. It's not affordable for a lot of folks. The government just doesn't do things very great already. If you put them in charge of everything, and it's not the most cost effective for us, there's no one who can come into the equation at that point and offer an alternative. And I mean, you can make the case it's hard to do it now. And again, that's because the government has already been given the power to legislate to do the opposite of what they should have been doing with capitalism. They, instead of putting red tape in place to stop capitalism from going corrupt and running amok, put red tape in place to stop anyone else from becoming competitors to the people that went corrupt and run amok. So the government, to me, that's just completely idiocy to think that letting the government have complete control of everything and not having competition, which is proven, that those people compete against each other for your business. That's how that works, and if it's being handled the right way, they want your business. If they're not doing what they need to be doing to get your business, they're going to go out of business. So they're going to be incentivized to compete for your sale. Okay, that's why retail, they push you to get that sale. They're all about making the money. And if they're not going to do things right, but when the government gets involved and stifles competition and they allow these monopolies, they're really not competing for your business. That's why their prices are reflected. That's why they don't really, they keep things high and they make all kinds of money for themselves. They're not competing for anything because they don't have to compete. There's no competitor.
Right.
And so you're already seeing what that would look like. If you go to Walmart and don't think that they, like their slogan says, have low prices every day anymore, understand that's because the closest thing they got to competition is, say, a Target. It used to be Kmart, but I don't even think Kmart's really around anymore. If there are, I haven't seen one in a long time. Right. But you might have Target, but Target's still very puny compared to Walmart in a lot of ways. A lot of these Walmarts, I don't see gas stations at Targets. So they're still not as big, so there's really no competition. And if there is competition, there's only one, maybe two chains that are even halfway close. The biggest competition Walmart has today is Amazon, and that's a digital online store.
Yeah.
So that's an apples to oranges comparison there, because one's brick and mortar and one's in the digital world. But that being said, that's showing us what it's going to look like if you just give one entity control of everything. And for the folks on the left who like to cite, FDR or like to cite Teddy Roosevelt, remember, Teddy Roosevelt was a big advocate for competition and the capitalism. So that's where we need to put that focus. People have the tendency, whether it be for any kind of socialism or any type of capitalism, to buy too much into those narratives. I'm not opposed to some ideas from socialism, but I would not adapt socialism entirely. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's very sustainable. There's also some ideas from capitalism, whereas the end game is to beat your competitor, even at the cost of trying to monopolize, even though that's not what we want from capitalism. I'm completely against that concept. I don't want monopolies. And so, looking at that, people have seen the downside of both ideas. The mainstream media, the politicians constantly fearmonger you with these sorts of things. And they make people think that that's really the problem, not the problem that the government getting involved has caused them to go wrong, and they're not keeping them in check like they should be. But just going off the two, it's going to be a lot easier to keep a government keeping some checks on a capitalism system as it should be. It's easier to do that than to just give all the power over to the government, and then we're supposed to hold them accountable some way, because we already can't hold them accountable for much now.
Yeah, I agree. We're coming up on like an hour and 40 minutes here, so I guess we'll close out. But that was a pretty good conversation, and I just want to, before we end, I just want your opinion on what's going to happen this election, and then what we should do going forward based on what you think the outcome is going to be.
Well, as me and David say so eloquently, we are about to have a brown wave. And I got news for you. With less than 30 days before election time, the tides are coming in at this point. So if you don't want to get, caught completely off guard, I suggest you start getting the boat ready or something, because when the tide finally hits, it's going to be a stinky mess. You're not going to want to be swimming around in that water for very long, I promise you. As far as what we need to do going forward, we can attack that two ways. We can talk about what we need to do as the independent indie media, or we could just talk about what we need to do as a people in general. What we need to do as a people in general is quit voting for these two parties. I mean, they're just utterly failing the system. Yeah. And, think of it like this. Out of what? Nearly 10 to 20 Republicans that tried to run 2016, because their stage didn't stay as full as long. But if you think about it, even in the early stages of the 2016 primary, they did have two different debate stages at one point. Didn't last very long, but lasted for a little while. So out of that whole crowd, even though I can see why he emerged, but Donald Trump emerged. And I can see why he emerged, because he was pitching the outsider message. You know what I mean? And a lot of people were looking for that at the time. But nonetheless, Donald Trump emerged, okay? But then we just went through a cycle on this side after a lot of people got that Donald Trump. And even for those who thought he might be the outsider, then they got a taste of Donald Trump and said, this doesn't taste like orange sherbet. This tastes like orange toilet bowl cleaner. This isn't what I thought it was going to be. I don't want any more of that, okay? Instead, they go and they wind up on the Democrat ticket instead of giving us another outsider who might actually be better. We didn't get a Tulsi. We didn't get the Bernie. We didn't get the Yang. And out of the three, obviously, I would prefer Tulsi by a wide margin.
Right.
But we didn't get any of those. Instead, we got stumbling Joe Biden. And his VP pick is Kamala Harris. And so let me get this straight. You didn't like that little bit of orange flavored whatever you got when you got Donald Trump. And now you want to put back into office the type of politicians that created this orange concoction that enabled this being to come into power because they made such a mess that it took and I referenced the orange because I watched a Lewis Black stand-up special recently, and he had a little bit in there about that, and it was pretty funny. But the thing is, you didn't like him, even if you didn't like him in 2016. No one's taking a step back to think about what created him. That a rich billionaire with a big mouth and an ego could just come out there and make some populist arguments and run through a primary and win a general election.
Against a Bush and
go ahead.
I said against a Bush and against a Clinton, and he won.
Absolutely. And, I brought that up with David. I do think to some degree that a lot of the people are getting tired of the dynasties. I think that if American people can recognize one big flaw, they can recognize the dynasties to a degree. I think that's why a lot of it, why Clinton went down to Obama in 2008. We know why Clinton won in 16 because they rigged the primary and Jeb Bush got utterly crushed. I think that the people that give them benefit of the doubt have that much. But at the same time, they're not recognizing what created a guy like Trump. And if you don't want more Trumps, don't keep putting the problem back in there as the replacement. So, my advice would be for indie media, it's time. Ventura said he could never rally the independents because it was like trying to herd cats. Right. It's time these cats get off the catnip. Because if you really want change in the country, you're going to have to start looking at what we can agree upon and start approaching this strategically, because the two parties have way too firm of a grasp on the system for us to keep splitting our votes 3-4 different ways, counting some write-ins. And it could go even beyond that when you get into write-ins. The more we divide how our votes are, all you got to do is go back and look at the argument when we were trying to break away from Britain. We've got to unite or die, join or die. And if you don't join, the British are going to win. So all these states, all these colonies have got to come together to fight this battle. So all these independents who are tired of the Democrats and the Republicans running roughshod have got to quit squabbling about who had the better green policy, or, who was going to get us to having battery-powered cars the fastest, when we both agree we want out of war. We both agree the war on drugs isn't productive. We both agree money in politics is a part of the problem. And if we actually sit down and have more conversation, there's probably a lot more we agree on, at least in principle, too. We can haggle out the fine details when we get rid of our biggest problem that's holding our country down.
Yes.
And so if you've got a channel, I think, reaching out to even people, if we're libertarians, reach out to some folks on the green. If you're green, reach out to some folks on the libertarian. Let's work together and let's talk to as many people. If they're not politically informed, plant that seed. Just drop little ideas out there. Like, for example, just say Joe Jorgensen, okay? Might not be here in 2024, but let's drop a name out there. Like right now, if I tell someone I'm voting for Joe Jorgensen, they go, who?
Right.
They don't know who it is. They don't hear that on Measure Me. So plant that seed and try to grow it. Do that with as many people as you can and start working together. If you keep this split, we're never going to stand a chance at taking it back from Dems or Republicans.
I could not agree more. All right, everyone, go check out his channel, the Lone Wolf Podcast, and we'll have you back on soon, Charles.
Appreciate it, Reed.